In our first video talking about the Industrial Revolution, we focused mainly on kind of the background, the history, what led up to it, why it started in England, and many of the demographic changes that sort of occurred. And when we talked about, things such as, the types, the processing and the actual manufacturing, what led to it starting in England, all of those kind of things that kind of created that, and then the changing of the actual labor system. So today what we're going to look at is the societal changes that really occurred. So we're looking at working conditions and then demographic actual changes that occurred throughout Europe, starting again within Great Britain. So some of this might be a little bit of review from US history, but it is always good to kind of revisit this information. So obviously, the Industrial Revolution makes massive societal changes, specifically for the workers. So there's a high demand for factory workers because now you have these massive machines, these massive factories, and they need a lot of people to work it, especially because they are more efficient. They can work at all times of the year because they are enclosed indoors, and not necessarily susceptible to bad weather like you would see necessarily with farming or perhaps other types of work. So that means that there is a higher demand for factory workers at the same time that there is a lower demand for guilds, for cottage workers, and farming, again, due to those technological improvements. We also kind of get with the enclosure movement where more land is divided and less land is actually used for farming at this point. That also does occur. So, yeah. And then especially as we get more like things more towards electricity, gas lights, things of that nature, allows people to work, again, more and longer hours, especially kind of in the nighttime, which you could not necessarily do in many other cases beforehand. So this also leads to more increased urbanization. We'll talk about that in the next slide when we actually get to societal and demographic changes. But that is one of the things. As more people are moving in, obviously that means they're going to be for more workers. So the changes and issues that the workers face. So obviously the type of work is typically repetitive in nature. Think more along the assembly line kind of model. When we talk about, you're doing one or two particular jobs repetitively over and over and over again due to that new division of labor, and they are what we consider to be low-skill jobs. And that doesn't mean that they don't take training, if they're not overly complicated, or that they're not complicated. It just means that it doesn't take someone very long to actually train them in on this, type of work. Think, to something like a doctor where, they're preparing for, years and years and years in order to, be perfect at their profession, or the idea of going back to the guilds where you were an apprentice for 5 to 10 years. That's what we mean by more high skilled, is that it took a very long time to essentially process and build these skills to be successful. So when we say low skill jobs, it's not that these jobs aren't difficult and that there's no difficulty with them or that they're not challenging. It's just it doesn't take you as long to get trained in and get experience doing this type of work. So because of the fact that they're repetitive, it's lower skilled, and obviously the massive amount of workers doing similar jobs, it leads to lower wages because now you have more people as a demand, especially again as the amount of people looking for work has increased and the amount of work that they can do has decreased. So the types of work they could have done in the past has decreased, but obviously factories need more workers to pump out their goods for more consumers. So lower wages. Longer hours, again, especially because, again, you can work throughout the night, throughout the year, as well as an increase in both female and child labor, which we will get back to here in a sec. So the average workday is, it depends on the source you're looking at, but about 12 to 14 hours. Typically the American workday, that we know of now, is about the 8-hour workday. So, that's about 40 hours a week. You get the weekends off for the most part. But back then, in England and throughout much of Europe, it was even in the United States or during this Industrial Revolution time. It's like about, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Children oftentimes are working about 10 hours a day. And we're talking, you start off when you're really, really young, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, maybe not 10 hours, but, as you get older, more and more and more. So by the time, they're your age where you're, 15, 16, 17 years old, you're getting close to working 12 to 14 hours a day. Really harsh punishments, a lot of physical beatings, beratement. I remember reading about something a number of years ago where they would literally, if you were a child anyway, and you were late, they would hold you up by your thumbs up against the guardrail in the factory just to kind of, again, show, do not be late. And so there's a lot of punishment for being late or falling asleep on the job or working slowly. And that's, again, if you're not fired for your work, they'll punish you in other ways, cut your wages, things of that nature. There's no compensation, so there's no insurance at this time. If you get hurt on the job, typically it's pushed on you, and we'll explain that more when we talk about workers' rights and things of that nature and, socialist movement. But yeah, essentially, if you're hurt on the job, most likely it's going to be blamed on you. And if you try and fight back, or if you're injured enough, you'll get fired. So there's kind of a disincentive to unionize at this point. And again, we'll revisit that, and then in another video. Jobs obviously very hazardous, so very likely to be accident prone. Very labor intensive, so you're more likely to hurt yourself doing these things, again, especially because of the hard physical labor. And then because factories are pumping out a lot of smoke and pollution, there's a lot of air pollution and respiratory issues. So a lot of people, dying of lung disease and things of that nature. Okay, so we got, I can't remember the exact term of what this woman is doing, but I don't remember the name of the work she's doing. But if you look at the beginning of the book, or not the beginning of the book, the beginning of the chapter, they're talking about essentially the work that this woman is doing. She's literally hauling, rocks and minerals and things like that out of the mine. It's probably coal, actually. Hauling the coal through the mines in this tiny little shaft, and it's literally just tied around her. And she's like, working it like you would essentially like a mule or a donkey or a horse pulling, or even oxen pulling all this stuff behind her, and that was her job. And that's described in the very beginnings of the chapter. Here, we got the child labor, all right, and then, the idea, so if anyone likes Mary Poppins, hate to ruin that for you, somebody like Bert, here played by Dick Van Dyke, is probably not going to live very long as a chimney sweep because, again, you're getting all that soot and everything into your system. So, again, a lot more health issues at this time, again, due to the type of work. So anyone, working in these plants, again, not a very good ventilation, if any ventilation at all. If you're living in these towns and areas, again, we'll revisit that. A lot of health hazards that come out of this time. Okay, so moving on to the women and children part, though. So women and children are working at this point in factories for a number of reasons. One, they can get jobs to provide for their families. So typically, think back when they were working in the farms or on the cottage system, they were all helping anyway. The difference now is when they move to the cities, it's more expensive and they all need to pitch in, especially again, if you're in the lower classes not making as much on the wages, you need as many people pitching in to help out as possible. And also women and children, they argued could be paid less because they're not as strong as your average man. So that meant that, well, if you can't do as much work as a man, well, why would I pay you to the same kind of amount that I would pay a man? Same thing with a child, male or female. Why would I pay you as much as an adult male who could pull more and work harder and do more labor-intensive jobs? So that is, part of that issue. And eventually, there's enough reforms both in England and also in the United States and other countries that experienced the Industrial Revolution that had been using child labor. They begin to reform and make changes because they're seeing, well, yes, they're helping to produce goods, but at what cost? Because this is the future of our country, and not only the future of our workforce, but also the future, entrepreneurs, the future lawyers, the future consumers and taxpayers. And so if they're not getting educated, they're not going to benefit us later on as a society. So instead, they, put in a lot of educational reforms that essentially say kids have to be in school so many, so many years in a row. Like with public education, you can obviously send them to private school too, but an emphasis on public education to get kids out of factories and have them working or getting them educated so that they can get better paying jobs and then again contribute, be more entrepreneurial, and then make more money for the society. And that's with increased literacy rates. So they're looking at this in the long term of how is this going to benefit our society in the long run instead of the immediate how is it going to benefit a business owner or a factory by making these exports. So, however, the working class will, for the most part, remain in poor position for better wages and rights, which is something, again, we will refer back to when we get to the socialism movements. Okay, so in terms of some data here, so we got, the average wages per week here between males and females in Great Britain with shillings during the Industrial Revolution. So again, here's the age discrepancy. So once you hit about 15, that's when the discrepancy changes between how much you're getting paid as a male and female. And you can see, it's, 4 times as much on average, or about 3 to 4 times as much between a male and a female in a factory. The starting age, okay, in Manchester and Stockport, this, being in the 18 teens, 1820s, okay, starting in, most likely to start at the very young age, and it's not the current age. There, very few of the actual workforce is, under 10, but most of them start at that younger age, and then, as you can see, those numbers, most of them are older adults, but most of them start when they are very, very young. And then obviously incidents of child labor due to those reforms continually decreased as they started putting in reforms in the late 1800s. So looking at societal changes from the Industrial Revolution. So while we're talking about, unfortunately, workers' rights aren't great and their standard of work isn't great, at least in terms of their treatment, the standard of living actually does increase with increased productivity, because this means that we can produce more, quicker, with lower prices. It's more affordable, and it's easier to transport. Think again back to the idea of steamships and railroads. So this means that we have more consumer products, more things that are considered, for a home that we'd see in a regular standard place. So you can buy more clothes. It's not just the same 2 or 3 things that you're wearing. It's, we can have various different clothes day in and day out. Different types of food. Again, that connects also to the Columbian Exchange and other things that we've been talking about for years and years that have kind of built throughout the course. Increase the furniture, books, agricultural tools, all that again with increased productivity that, is more for leisure and, having a nice home and increasing the standard of living. But tying this back to the urbanization. So again, the factories are being set up mainly in cities or on the outskirts of cities. And as previously stated, more people are moving there in order to get work. And we also have the overall population growth from, a number of things. So I'm going to skip that and just kind of go here. Okay, increased food supply, medical research, so vaccinations, things of that nature, what's causing diseases, things of that. Increased sanitation, so better sewers and things of that nature, leading to longer lives, increased birth rates, or as the birth rates remain high, not increased birth rates. So think demographic stage 2 from human geography. And, again, just better overall research and knowledge of how to live a healthy lifestyle. Now, initially, urbanization is really, really poor. Think back to the idea of tenements and things of that nature, back from when we talked about it in U.S. history, because the increase of the massive number of people to these cities, mixed in with factory pollution, both in the air and in the water, so think about drinking water and how that's not great, with hastily built accommodations, so think tenements and overcrowding, lead to a lot of these problems. So the wealthy are able to move further to the outskirts, or they're able to have better homes, better access to the water, or kind of in the beginning of suburbs, while the working class poor are centered again in those tight spots right next to the factory, which is in walking distance for them to get to work. So they are the ones more susceptible to the immediate pollution and dangers and health hazards that exist at that point. And this is unfortunately still kind of a ringing truth that where you look at this in the United States, that, typically the people with the highest levels of risk of health hazards are the ones right next to the factories, to the closest areas of pollution. And that is unfortunately not really changed, and now we see that more again with lower income and people of color facing those at higher rates than you do other groups here in the United States, so upper and middle class and whites. So there's also why city planning is important. That's why we do the Industrial Revolution game in class, where so you can kind of see that growth from Manchester within 40 years jumps over 300,000. And you can kind of see that in these other places as well, due to the Industrial Revolution, and city planning was not prepared for it. So at the same time, so other societal changes, we see the creation with urbanization of new social classes. So the landed wealth and nobility, while still having wealth, they're not as important in society or in politics when you see the growth of that middle and upper class that's related to, the increase of the amount of money from factories. So we get that. So most of the stuff that we actually see the increased standard of living is for that new growing class of doctors, lawyers, the people running the factories, or the managers, the owners, things of that nature to kind of do that. So they push for middle class values and middle and upper class values on the lower classes. So that's also where we get, for those that have done that stuff, I believe you do this in, Honors Com 10 when you talk about the cult of domesticity for the roles of women, for the middle and upper class. Well, working class women obviously are still willing, or still having to work in the factories and provide, while middle and upper class women, they get more education, but aren't able to really expand or vote. And so their roles are limited. And we also see the increase in leisure sports and activities, so like soccer, baseball, things of that nature. So you kind of see, again, the population densities here within, England, all that. There's all these football clubs. Manchester kind of on that bright spot, turning into obviously something like this. And then I kind of use this to kind of image. So if you've ever seen Downton Abbey, so I love the show, but you have the Crawleys here, Old English aristocracy. He's a member of the House of Lords, but that's kind of, again, more of a noble position, but he doesn't really have a whole lot in the world. And initially, they don't have a good viewpoint of the business class and slowly begin to accept it with a guy like Andrew Carnegie, even though it's a US example. So we'll stop here, pick up with socialism in the next video.